My husband sent me a text from Miami. I eloped with your best friend. We're not coming back. I stared at the screen while the coffee in my hand slowly turned cold. Outside the kitchen window, the early morning sun lit up the flower bed we'd planted together just 2 weeks before. Inside, the only sound was the faint ticking of the wall clock. It felt impossibly loud. A second message appeared. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Move on. That was all. 15 years of marriage reduced to 20 words and a period. I didn't cry. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't call either of them. Instead, I typed 3 words. Best of luck. Then I quietly opened my laptop. Within the next hour, every joint credit card was frozen. Every shared account required new authorization. I called a locksmith and scheduled an emergency visit before lunch. By sunset, every lock on the house had been replaced. The security codes were different, and his fingerprints no longer opened the front door. For the first time in years, the house belonged only to me. I slept better than I expected. Then, just after sunrise, loud knocking rattled the front door. 3 police officers stood on my porch. One rested a hand on his notebook while another asked calmly, "Ma'am, are you the owner of this property?" I nodded. "We've received a report claiming you illegally locked your husband out of his own home." I looked past them toward the empty driveway where his SUV should have been. A slow smile almost reached my face. He really thought I'd panic. He had no idea. I'd spent months quietly preparing for the day he underestimated me one last time. My name is Claire, and for 15 years, I believed loyalty was something you built every single day. I wasn't the loud one in the marriage. I wasn't the dramatic one either. I handled the mortgage payments, remembered birthdays, balanced the household budget, and quietly solved problems before anyone else even noticed they existed. From the outside, our life looked comfortable, stable, even enviable. Inside, I had slowly become invisible. My husband, Daniel, loved telling people he was the dreamer while I was good with paperwork. Everyone laughed, including me, because correcting him always seemed pointless. What no one realized was that every investment, every insurance policy, every financial decision that kept our life secure had been researched, organized, and managed by me. Daniel enjoyed the rewards while assuming the details would always take care of themselves. My best friend, Vanessa, had been part of my life for nearly 20 years. She celebrated holidays in our home, knew where we kept the spare key, and often joked that she was practically family. I believed her. Looking back, I can see moments that should have concerned me, shared glances, private jokes that stopped when I entered the room, excuses to stay behind after gatherings, but trust has a way of blinding you to what feels impossible. Over the last year, Daniel had become distant. He traveled more for business meetings, guarded his phone, and answered simple questions with irritation instead of conversation. Whenever I sensed something was wrong, he smiled, kissed my forehead, and told me I worried too much. After hearing that enough times, I started questioning my own instincts instead of his behavior. What Daniel never understood was that silence isn't weakness. I had spent years paying attention while everyone else underestimated me. I knew exactly whose names were on every account, every deed, every insurance document, and every legal agreement. He believed I would react emotionally because that was the version of me he had created in his own mind. He never stopped to consider that the quiet person in the room is often the one who already knows what everyone else has overlooked. The police left after I calmly showed them the deed to the house, the updated ownership records, and the legal paperwork proving I had every right to secure my home. They apologized for the inconvenience, wished me a good morning, and drove away. I watched their patrol car disappear before closing the front door with the same quiet certainty I had felt the night before. As I stood in the hallway, my thoughts drifted back over the previous year. The betrayal hadn't begun with that text from Miami. It had started with things so small that anyone else would have dismissed them. Daniel had stopped asking about my day. During dinner, he would scroll through his phone while giving distracted nods whenever I spoke. If I paused in the middle of a sentence, waiting to see if he would notice, the silence usually stretched until I quietly finished clearing the table myself. Vanessa noticed the change too, or at least I believed she did. She would tilt her head sympathetically and tell me that marriages went through difficult seasons. Then, moments later, she would laugh at one of Daniel's jokes a little longer than everyone else, exchanging a glance that disappeared the instant I looked their way. Family gatherings became strangely uncomfortable. Daniel interrupted me more often, correcting details that didn't need correcting or finishing my stories before I could. Whenever someone complimented the home or our financial stability, he accepted the praise with an easy smile, never mentioning that I had spent years building both. I wasn't angry. I was becoming invisible in plain sight. There were quieter signs as well. Hotel charges appeared on credit card. Statements from cities where his meetings ended early. Receipts disappeared before I could file them. Weekend conferences suddenly required an extra day away. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own, but together they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. I never confronted him. Instead, I listened carefully, saved every statement, and paid attention to every inconsistency. Daniel mistook my silence for blindness. Vanessa mistook my kindness for naivety. Neither of them realized that while they were growing more confident in their deception, I was quietly learning exactly how much they underestimated the woman they believed would never see the truth coming. The moment that changed everything didn't happen in Miami. It happened 3 weeks earlier in my own kitchen. Daniel had left his laptop on the counter while he stepped outside to take what he called a quick work call. A message appeared on the screen. I wasn't trying to invade his privacy. I was simply reaching over to silence the notification. Instead, I caught a glimpse of Vanessa's name. 3 more weeks, the message read. Then we never have to pretend again. I didn't open the conversation. I didn't need to. Those 9 words answered every question I had been asking myself for months. When Daniel came back inside, I smiled, poured him another cup of coffee, and asked whether his Miami conference was still scheduled. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "Just meetings. I'll probably be exhausted the whole time." That was the last lie I ever allowed myself to believe. Over the next several weeks, I stopped reacting and started preparing. I met quietly with an attorney during my lunch breaks. I gathered copies of financial records, property documents, insurance policies, and every agreement with both of our names on it. I changed passwords on my personal accounts, moved sentimental belongings to a secure storage unit, and documented every transaction that seemed unusual. None of it was illegal. None of it was impulsive. I wasn't setting a trap. I was making sure I wouldn't be caught in one. The final confirmation arrived the morning Daniel boarded his flight. A mutual acquaintance posted an innocent-looking photo from the airport cafe. Daniel and Vanessa were sitting together across the table, sharing breakfast. Their luggage was beside them, and neither looked remotely concerned about being seen. I stared at the picture for less than a minute before setting my phone down. Hours later, his text from Miami arrived exactly as they had planned. He expected heartbreak, frantic phone calls, and desperate bargaining. Instead, he received 3 simple words. Best of luck. The message wasn't written in anger. It was the quiet acknowledgement that by choosing betrayal, he had walked away from the only person who had spent weeks making sure she would never have to chase him again. People often imagine revenge as something loud, slammed doors, angry speeches, or dramatic confrontations. Mine looked nothing like that. It looked like folders, calendars, appointments, and careful timing. Years before any of this happened, I had built a career as a senior compliance manager for a regional financial services firm. My job required precision, documentation, and understanding how small details could determine the outcome of much larger problems. I wasn't a lawyer, but I had spent years working alongside legal teams, auditors, and fraud investigators. I knew the difference between acting emotionally and acting responsibly. The day after I saw Vanessa's message on Daniel's laptop, I scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney. I didn't ask how to punish my husband. I asked how to protect myself. The attorney reviewed our financial situation, property records, and state laws, explaining exactly what I could and couldn't do. I followed every piece of advice without taking a single shortcut. I opened a new bank account in my name alone and redirected my paycheck there, something I was legally entitled to do. I downloaded copies of tax returns, mortgage statements, insurance policies, and investment records, storing them in encrypted digital folders and a secure physical file. Every document was dated, organized, and backed up. When Daniel left for Miami, I didn't empty our joint accounts or sell anything that wasn't mine. Instead, I froze the joint. Credit cards to prevent new debt from being created in both our names and immediately. notified the financial institutions of suspected unauthorized future use. I also hired a licensed locksmith to replace the locks on the house after confirming my legal right to secure the property. Every invoice, receipt, and authorization was carefully preserved. By the time Daniel sent his triumphant text, every decision had already been reviewed, documented, and completed. There was no panic left, no uncertainty, and no need for arguments. He believed he had carefully planned his escape. What he never considered was that while he had been planning to leave, I had been quietly planning to stand firmly on legal ground when he did. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded with the quiet precision of falling dominoes, each one triggered by a choice Daniel had made long before he ever boarded that flight to Miami. The morning after the police left, my phone rang repeatedly. I let every call go to voicemail. Daniel's first message was irritated. "Open the house. This has gone far enough." An hour later, the tone had changed. "My cards aren't working. The hotel says the reservation was canceled." "What did you do?" I listened to the voicemail once before saving it with the others. I didn't respond. I hadn't canceled his trip or stranded him. The hotel reservation had been tied to the joint card he assumed would always be available. Once that account was frozen to prevent additional shared debt, the authorization failed. The consequences weren't created by me. They were created by the financial arrangements he had taken for granted. Later that afternoon, my attorney called to tell me that Daniel had hired a lawyer of his own. That wasn't surprising. What surprised him, according to my attorney, was how thoroughly everything had been documented. Every financial decision had a paper trail. Every change had been made within my legal rights. Every conversation had been recorded through emails, receipts, or official correspondence. There was nothing dramatic left to argue about. By evening, a mutual friend quietly reached out. "I don't think Miami turned out the way they expected," she said. Apparently, reality had arrived faster than romance. Without unrestricted access to shared finances and without the comfort of a home waiting for them, Daniel and Vanessa were no longer celebrating. They were arguing about hotel bills, travel plans, and who was responsible for the mess they had created. I closed the curtains as the sun disappeared beyond the trees and set my phone on silent. For the first time in months, the house felt peaceful. I hadn't destroyed Daniel's life. I had simply removed myself as the person quietly holding it together. Everything that happened afterward was the result of choices he had confidently made, believing someone else would always be there to absorb the consequences. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. There were no dramatic confrontations outside the courthouse, no screaming matches on the front lawn, and no desperate attempts to force me into a conversation. Instead, the truth traveled the way it usually does, through calm conversations, legal paperwork, and people comparing stories that no longer matched Daniel's version of events. At first, he told friends that I had overreacted and locked him out without warning. That explanation lasted only until the facts began to surface. People learned he hadn't been abandoned at all. He had voluntarily left the marriage, traveled to Miami with my closest friend, and announced his decision in a text message. Once that became known, the sympathy he expected quietly disappeared. Vanessa's circle wasn't much kinder. Friends who had trusted her with their own families suddenly kept their distance. Invitations became less frequent, phone calls slowed, and the excitement she imagined surrounding her new beginning faded into uncomfortable silence. Trust, once broken so publicly, proved difficult to rebuild. As for me, I discovered that peace doesn't always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it arrives in ordinary moments. Making breakfast without waiting for someone else's schedule. Reading a book in complete silence. Unlocking my own front door without wondering what explanation I would hear next. Those simple routines reminded me how much of myself I had sacrificed trying to preserve a relationship that only one person was protecting. The divorce moved forward steadily, guided by documents instead of emotions. Every decision became another reminder that preparation is far more powerful than panic. I wasn't fighting to win against Daniel anymore. I was simply building a future that no longer depended on someone else's loyalty. Looking back, I realized the real betrayal wasn't just that my husband left with my best friend. It was that they believed I would collapse under the weight of their choices. That's why this story matters. Not because revenge is satisfying, but because self-respect is. When someone mistakes your kindness for weakness, you don't always need the loudest response. Sometimes the strongest answer is to quietly protect your peace and let the truth do the rest. Nearly a year has passed since that morning when the police knocked on my door. The divorce is final now. The house is still mine. But it feels different, not because the furniture changed, but because the weight I carried for so many years is finally gone. I repainted the kitchen, planted new flowers in the garden, and donated the things that reminded me of a life built on someone else's promises. Every small change became a quiet reminder that healing isn't one dramatic moment. It's 1,000 ordinary decisions that slowly give you your life back. People occasionally ask if I ever heard from Daniel again. I did. Months after everything was settled, he sent one final email. It wasn't an apology in the way movies portray them. There were no grand declarations or desperate pleas. It was simply an admission that the life he imagined in Miami had fallen apart almost as quickly as it had begun. Vanessa eventually left him, blaming the pressure and constant arguments. The excitement they mistook for love couldn't survive everyday reality. I read the message once, then I archived it without replying. Not because I hated him, because I no longer needed anything from him. That more than anything else surprised me. I used to think closure came from hearing the right words. Instead, I learned that closure comes when someone else's choice is no longer. Control your emotions. Today, I mentor young professionals at work and volunteer at a local community legal aid clinic, helping people understand the importance of protecting themselves before a crisis ever begins. If my experience has taught me anything, it's that preparation is never a sign of distrust. It is an act of self-respect. Looking back, I don't think my revenge was freezing credit cards or changing locks. Those were simply practical decisions. The real revenge was refusing to let betrayal define the rest of my life. Daniel expected to leave me with an empty house. Instead, he left me with a chance to rebuild a life that finally belonged to me. And sometimes, the quietest victories echo the longest because the strongest ending isn't watching someone else lose. It's realizing you've already won the moment you stopped chasing what chose to leave.